Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eric Beerbaum, and I serve as director of the Edmond Lily Safra Center for Ethics. And begin on a bittersweet note that I want to say a few words remembering Dennis Thompson, who passed away on March 30th. As founding director of the Edmond Lily Safra Center for Ethics and Alfred North Whitehead Professor, he launched the center nearly 40 years ago to tackle moral questions in public life. He reshaped democratic theory, he redefined institutional corruption, and to me, he was my greatest mentor, warm, humble, brilliant, and he had that wit. He could synthesize any discussion, any lecture, any seminar. His legacy thrives in the life of the center, and he showed us ethics isn't abstract, the work of bettering democracy, step by step, even in moments of seeming futility, which brings us to tonight's lecture, not the futility, but the hope. Professor Desmond Jagmohan, a political theorist at UC Berkeley and a leading scholar in American and African-American political thought. His forthcoming book, Dark Virtues, Booker T. Washington's Tragic Realism, reimagines Washington as a virtue theorist of the oppressed, rooted in years of archival research. His second book project, Veiled Agency, reads Harriet Jacobs' slave narrative as a profound moral and political theory of slavery's distinct wrongs. His recent articles, like Three Traditions of African-American Political Thought in the Annual Review of Political Science and Peculiar Property in the Journal of Politics, explore how the oppressed cultivate agency and resist unjust systems, often through deception and ambivalence, and always under extreme constraints. Winner of the APSA Best Dissertation Award and fellowships at Princeton, Stanford, and Berkeley, Professor Jagmohan's scholarship brings urgent insight to our moment. Please join me in welcoming him to speak on moral life under oppression, Booker T. Washington, and the ethics of deception.
So today I want to press two claims. The first, historical in nature, argues that an accommodationist public philosophy became the mask behind which Booker T. Washington vanished. The second, more philosophical, insists that that protective front still conceals from us the virtue politics for the oppressed, that Washington both practiced and silently taught, an ethics of deception born in response to tyranny. When it comes to the moral life of the subjugated, we should accept that the truth often lies beneath the surface of appearance. For the oppressed, concealment and deception frequently prove the sounder and steadier means of resistance. This was certainly true for Washington, whose political thought was formed in one of the most extreme contexts in American history. A formerly enslaved person who came of age during Reconstruction. By 1881, Washington had become the president of a small rural college in Alabama. From that office, he witnessed the rise and entrenchment of white supremacy. In 1895, he made his famous plea for African Americans to abstain from politics and work instead on improving their economic lot and acquiring practical education. The appeal, which summed up his public philosophy, struck an appeasing chord with the nation, essentially making him the foremost leader of the race in the eyes of both white and black Americans. Over time, that conciliatory cast invited criticism from those who accused them of encouraging African Americans to barter away their rights and dignity for menial jobs and inadequate training. Contesting what has become conventional wisdom, that he was an accommodationist who believed only in half measures, I argue that Washington authored a realist politics that called for striking at white supremacy, but doing so through a mask. Seeing that the North had washed its hands of race, he decided African Americans were alone in their struggle for freedom. Regardless of where they stood on the slavery question, white Northerners in Washington's day avoided any racial controversies that could reignite sectional conflict. This moral abdication partly explains why neither the codification of white supremacy in law nor its extra-legal cruelties like lynching triggered much of a response in the North. Seeing that the nation had capitulated to white supremacy by 1890, African Americans would have to resist their oppressors from behind enemy lines and without Northern support. Being generally impoverished and unarmed, black Southerners would be defenseless against legal and extra-legal retaliation. Widely publicizing or loudly protesting Southern cruelties would persuade neither Congress nor the cavalry to intervene. Therefore, it was tactically wise for them to consider stealth insurgency rather than frontal assaults, a long resistance in which as combatants they practice evasion, concealment, and deception to effectively sabotage white supremacy. Washington taught that African Americans were better off learning to appear in public as compliant and non-threatening, even as they sharpened their knives. My central proposition is that Washington used compromising means to pursue radical ends. In making this claim, I neither celebrate nor condemn his politics of deception. Instead, I seek to understand the economic, social, and political conditions that shaped his thinking, judgment, and actions, without losing sight of his normative commitments, ideological biases, and private motives. The now common view of him as an accommodationist was not invented nor attributed to him by vindictive adversaries. It followed plausibly from the falsehood he authored to support and conceal his radical ends. I have therefore organized my book to show that Washington, confronted with a scene of extreme domination, used conciliatory means or words to aid and mask his radical deeds. And the restrained rhetoric that followed determined his historical fate. You all now know him as an accommodationist. It worked. This structure brings into focus the fact that he united two concerns rarely brought together in the history of ideas: virtue and domination. It helps to see more clearly the context-sensitive nature of his political thought, namely his virtue politics of the oppressed. How should we handle the falseness and fraud we've inherited from Washington? His public perception as a compromising leader in a time of extreme racial oppression. In pursuing this question, I recover a more subversive Washington, but just mining his published writings and public statements will not adequately reveal his true political commitments, let alone his reliance on ambivalence, concealment, and deceit to safeguard himself and others as he worked to undermine white supremacist conditions in the South, including pursuing a legal campaign, a clandestine legal campaign that took cases all the way to the Supreme Court. We must immerse ourselves in his vast archive, including his immense correspondence, to witness the rare moments when his mask slipped and his true face more momentarily revealed itself. That means casting a wide contextual net that allows us to see truths shrouded in lies. And if we're going to understand his politics of deception, we must confront that world that compelled him to practice deception with such extraordinary skill and care. The best way to do so is to visit that world from the beginning. Let us consider then the night lynchers went to his door. At around 10 p.m. on Saturday, June 8, 1895, residents of the northeast section of Tuskegee, Alabama, were startled by the furious barking of dogs, followed by several gunshots and agonized shrieks. Moses Wright went outside to see what had roused the dogs, and he saw Thomas Harris, the city's lone black lawyer, frantically telling his white neighbor, John Alexander, that he feared for his life. He had heard that a mob was coming to kill him that night. Harris pleaded with Alexander to protect him, but Alexander refused. Catching a glimpse of several masked men in the distance, Harris yelled, "There they are now, coming to kill me." When he tried to push past Alexander, the two middle-aged men began tussling. Seconds later, a masked man appeared in the yard and aimed his pistol at the back of Harris's head. At the instant he squeezed the trigger, Harris slipped and the bullet hit Alexander, entering his lower throat and continuing transversely backwards, striking the cervical vertebra and eventually lodging in his right shoulder blade. In abject terror, Harris ran through the crowd and out of the gate, and several shots were fired at him, one of which struck him in the thigh and dropped him a few feet from his own gate. Distraught that they'd shot and likely killed a respected white man, the mob rushed Alexander into his house and tried desperately to save his life. Miraculously, he survived. The yelling of upset neighbors drew more men and boys to the scene, further swelling the mob. But amid the clamor and confusion, as the newspapers reported, Harris managed to get up from where he fell and left town immediately and has not been heard of since. Shaking himself free from the paralyzing horror of what had unfolded before his eyes, Harris's 22-year-old son, Wiley, sprinted to his father. In the din and darkness of the moment, Wiley got his father into a buggy and took him to the African-American college located 1.5 miles from the center of town. There they pounded on the door of its president, Booker T. Washington. Washington opened the door and heard that a mob of local whites had shot Thomas Harris and was searching for him. He knew that Southern whites were adept at reading the tracks of their prey, and they would soon arrive at his door, most likely to lynch both father and son. Having lived in Tuskegee for 14 years and having taught Thomas at the college in 1883 and 1884, Washington recognized the two men. Yet, as he explained to the mob and reporters, he refused to shelter them, since it would be unsafe and unsound. This is the Harris family. The newspaper said later that Washington, the president of the Negro College, has ever conducted himself in the school in the most prudent and conservative manner, and learning that a mob was in pursuit of Harris, told him that he could not be admitted there. What has become of Harris, we do not know. Later, the paper reported that it was still unknown where Wiley had taken his gravely injured father, after they were denied sanctuary by the college president, Booker T. Washington. Washington faced an intolerable dilemma that evening. The public record suggests that he acted prudently and conservatively. Sheltering Thomas and Wiley Harris would have been a grave risk. If the mob learned that Washington had hidden them on campus, it would likely have incinerated the school and maimed or killed faculty and students. Fearing such an outcome was sensible. Washington had witnessed the sharp rise in mob violence over the years. In 1881, the year he moved to Alabama, there were no recorded lynchings in the state and only 15 nationally. In 1893, whites had lynched 154 African Americans nationwide, with Alabama's total of 26 earning it the contemptible distinction of that state with the most lynchings in the country. Nearly 800 African Americans were lynched across the United States between 1890 and 1895 alone. As president of the college, Washington felt an obligation to protect the school and its faculty and students from such harm. His duty outweighed obligations he might have had to the two men seeking shelter. One of the central claims of this lecture, and what I'm happy to talk to in the Q&A, is the way an office constrains one morally. The choice must have weighed heavily on Washington. He had created the college from nothing. When he arrived in Tuskegee to take up his post as president, the institution did not in fact exist. The promise of a school was the result of a political bargain. African Americans in the county had been told that if they voted as directed in the 1880 election, they would get a teacher training and industrial school. The race hadn't yet been disenfranchised. That doesn't begin until the 1890s. Once the vote was in, the state provided $2,000 for faculty salaries with no funds appropriated for purchasing land or buildings. A true guarantee, they believed, against the school ever existing. Washington had other ideas. He borrowed $500 from his alma mater and purchased a 100-acre farm on the outskirts of Tuskegee. a small city located 40 miles east of Montgomery. Always discerning, he deeded the property to the institution. The state will have no control over the land, he wrote to his former colleague J.F.B. Marshall, so that if the state withdrew its appropriation at any time, the school could still live. Imagine a state doing that. On July 4, 1881, the university opened with 33 students who were taught in a dilapidated cabin on the farm. By the end of the year, the college boasted 3 instructors and 88 students. When Thomas Harris went to the campus with a bullet in his leg, the Tuskegee Institute had expanded to 34 buildings on 1,500 acres with 75 faculty members and 750 students. The college had become an important outpost of racial progress and had provoked distrust, fear, and resentment among local whites, especially those tormented by unabating poverty and needing only a slight push to bring their violent bitterness to its doors. A vulnerability to terrorism may have compelled Washington to turn Thomas and Wiley Harris away from his university that night, but he must have known that his choice would strike some as an unpardonable failure, the sort that could irreparably damage a reputation still in the making. Washington's private correspondence suggests that he deliberately deceived the public as to what occurred after the men arrived at his door. When he delivered his now famous speech at the Atlanta Exposition, it was just 3 months after the Harris affair. That speech not only thrust him into the national spotlight, it also brought accusations that Washington was playing to the hands of Southern whites. Not long after the Atlanta speech, his friend Francis Grimke wrote Washington to tell him of a recent annual meeting of a literary and historical society where Washington's actions were discussed in detail. They're saying an African American from Tuskegee was shot for entertaining a white preacher overnight and brought to your school, hoping that you might receive him and provide him aid. I felt it, and that you refused. I felt it to be my duty to apprise you of what was said. I thought that you ought to know what is being circulated, Grimke essentially said. Washington replied to Grimke that he'd heard what others were saying about him and about the judgment he made that fateful night. Then he described the events to Grimke. After the man was shot and his son brought him to my house for help and advice, and you can easily understand that the people in and about Tuskegee come to me for help and advice in all their troubles. I got out of bed and went out and explained to the man and his son that personally I would do anything I could for them. But I could not take the wounded man into the school and endanger the lives of students entrusted by their parents to my care, especially given the fury of drunken white men possibly showing up. Neither did I, for the same reason, feel that it was the right thing to take him into my own house. For as much as I love the colored people in that section, I cannot feel that I am in duty bound to shelter them in all their personal troubles, any more than you feel called on to do the same thing in Washington. I explained my position fully to the man and his son, and they agreed with me as to the wisdom of my course. And I now state what I've not said to anyone before. I helped them to a place of safety and paid the money out of my own pocket for the comfort and treatment of the man while he was sick. Today I have no warmer friends than this man and his son. So this is a startling new account of what occurred that night and differs quite a bit from what appeared in the public record. There is no reason to doubt that many locals brought their woes to Washington's door, and no basis for disputing what he said next. He explained that after listening to Thomas and Wiley Harris with perfect sympathy, he described his reasoning to them, and they agreed, or in their desperation perhaps simply acquiesced. It seems clear that Washington chose not to conceal the 2 men at the university because openly doing so would have abrogated his responsibility to protect students and faculty from harm. He had 2 competing moral demands. Washington added that he did not care to publicize what he did and was only mentioning it to Grimke to clear up with a trusted friend a false representation he could not address publicly. I simply chose to help and relieve this man in my own way rather than in a way someone 1,000 miles away would have had me do it, Washington said. And he added that he had no warmer friends than the two men. Washington would have been morally justified in turning the two men away for the reasons he gave, one might argue. It was wise for him to believe that concealing them on campus, including in his home, would be discovered sooner or later by the public. And that in the wake of that revelation, lynchers would return to campus and seek retribution. Yet he chose to save their lives at great physical and professional risk to himself. I helped them to a place of safety and paid the money out of my own pocket for the comfort and treatment of Thomas Harris, he said. Washington may not have been wholly forthcoming with Grimke, however. Weighing the interest of his students and family, it seems probable that Washington still concealed Harris and his son on campus or at his home for a period that night, but that he did not disclose all that he did, even to his friend. It seemed implausible that he would leave in the middle of the night with a lynch mob on their tail. Washington knew that this entire incident would mean severing moral goodness from social esteem, and that's the key. The goodness is in the dark. You don't get to derive any esteem for it. In fact, you have to do the opposite publicly. And in doing so, he would ultimately forfeit the regard of some African Americans. Neither he nor the two men he protected could openly discuss his actions that night. Validating that he did save them, Thomas Harris wrote to Washington on September 29, 1895. I remember all of your kindness to me, and I will not take time to mention them, as you know them all. Harris added, I think I will be able to one day walk on my leg, though one will be shorter than the other. A week later, under the alias R.B. Jones, Harris told Washington of his efforts to defend him and the school without exposing either to injury. Harris said he'd been cautiously defending Washington and the institution to those who had been misled by the newspapers regarding his actions that night he came to the campus. Harris hid the truth to protect Washington and the university from retaliation, because he also understood that public life was a deadly game of theater for African Americans in the Jim Crow South. Although he told the public he had sent them away, Washington, in fact, saved the lives of Thomas and Wiley Harris. The correspondence with Grimke makes clear that his actions were embedded in a social and political context in which concealment and deception were both shrewd and virtuous. Neither the lynchers nor the reporters who went to Washington's door questioned the story he gave them. Choosing not to shelter two African Americans fleeing a lynch mob was consistent with his reputation as a conservative leader, beloved by philanthropists and supported by politicians. Notice the tablets. And that was the point. Effectively resisting white supremacy from within the South required playing a social role that would sustain the trust and goodwill of whites. What he couldn't have anticipated is all the posthumous insults, including tablets representing him essentially imparting the lessons of the Klan. In the New Yorker, nonetheless. It required wearing a mask that would make fraught interracial interactions safe. In the context in which he found himself, it was imperative for white Southerners and their northern enablers to view Washington as a reliable source, someone whose testimony they could trust. Whites drew their conclusions about Washington from the positions he staked out in public, especially the claim that he sought only marginal advancements for African Americans, though behind that mask he was pursuing quite expansive civil rights campaigns. From their epistemically disadvantaged position, it was reasonable for them to see Washington as a conservative. Their belief in him rested on trust, on believing that his words honestly conveyed his politics. If they had detected deception in his voice, their conviction would have flagged. Deception was for Washington a crucial and delicate means of realizing moral and political agency in a condition of extremity. That's the main claim. Digging into Washington's archive, we find implicit in both his public writings and his private conduct the idea that certain ethical and moral obligations may be overridden in emergency conditions like slavery and Jim Crow. Under both these conditions, African Americans face grave threats to their survival. And in both cases, those threats came from whites and were backed by law and force. Washington believed these related and systematic forms of group oppression justified overriding any prima facie duty African Americans in the South owed to whites. Therefore, a more complete picture of Washington requires reading his published writings against the authorial and editorial grain and immersing oneself in his archive. Based on my own immersion, I argue that the real source of Washington's moral self-negation was the emergency condition in which he lived and exercised leadership. He was forced to make tragic choices as a black leader living under the yoke of white supremacy, routinely between genuinely incompatible but unequally undesirable options. He saw that whatever he did in those situations would come with a great cost, including harsh criticism and disapproval from many he admired. My argument is not that oppressed people should be exempt from moral evaluation, but that any analysis of their choices and behavior should take into account the context in which they made those choices and took those courses of actions. And those contexts can change on a dime. You can wake up one day and realize being a permanent resident isn't permanent. Political judgments are all things considered judgments. And African Americans living in the Jim Crow South at the turn of the century had a much narrower range of possibilities than the average person living in contemporary America. They faced strategic and moral calculations very different from those faced by Americans today, though that may change. That was why Washington offered a conditional justification for the deception he practiced and quietly encouraged between the lines. He thought it was a right and reasonable response for African Americans living in the South. After all, he did not have the luxury of a political morality tailored to ordinary conditions, or even one suited to the less dreadful conditions in the North at the time. Just securing life in the Jim Crow South obliged African Americans to exercise a compromising political subjectivity. In the late 19th century, Americans still practiced a folk virtue ethics that saw moral character and social fate as inextricably linked. That agent-centered morality significantly shaped Washington's thinking, conduct, and teachings. Like most of his contemporaries, he viewed ethics and politics through the lens of character and virtue. He considered the virtuousness of agents rather than the abstract acontextual principles when judging the rightness or wrongness of their conduct. Motives and consequences mattered, but for Washington, living in the South, cultivating the right character was crucial for safeguarding one's life and achieving success. And by character, I simply mean a set of character traits or a composite of a certain set of traits, virtues, and vices. Virtually everyone saw character as the mainspring of conduct, and therefore as the principal source of action guidance. Focusing solely on motive can elide the social sensitive side of virtue, I want to suggest. In a different situation, moral traits or traits considered virtues might become vices. Think about it. The role morality of soldiers in war and the role morality of citizens in peace are at times incompatible. In an acute crisis or overriding emergency, a person has to be discerning with the truth. The injunction to be truthful with everyone would have harmed the interest and welfare of African Americans in the South. They lived in a Hobbesian world, an atmosphere of conflict and suspicion, and that world punished confidence and trust in white people. In the kind of realist view to which Washington subscribed, sincerity and truthfulness were to be considered not as exceptionless, but as context-sensitive virtues that should govern social interactions and relations with some people, but not with others. By endorsing and practicing white supremacy, whites of Washington's day voided their claim to truth and sincerity from African Americans. Certainly, Washington thought it was morally permissible and strategically desirable for him to deceive the press regarding Thomas and Wiley Harris. Like war, oppression favors the dissembler. Recall that virtues are dispositions that equip a person to respond well to the demands of their social world. For an enslaved woman, what should count as a virtue? Should she tell the truth no matter what? Washington, who carried the scars of bondage, he was born in slavery, spent his first 9 years there, recognized that slavery forced enslaved people to deceive at times. His political thought went even further. For him, the oppressed was not only permitted to deceive their oppressors and the people who abetted those oppressors, they were morally required to do so some of the times. The capacity to be equivocal, cagey and deceitful, without inviting suspicion, offered the oppressed a vital edge in their struggle against domination. You had to be able to morally code switch on a fly. For instance, concealment allows a subjugated person to exercise some power over her subjugator by denying him knowledge of her ends, thereby undermining his capacity to frustrate her pursuit of those ends. To mislead or misdirect others by camouflaging your intentions and movements lessens their power over you, disadvantaging them epistemically and thus strategically. In other words, concealment is a strategic response. In crafting his political response to white supremacy, Washington, recovering the skills he learned as an enslaved child that enabled him to survive and subvert the institution and its guardians, looked to the subaltern realism of enslaved people. Later, he recognized the value of that realism for combating white supremacy, the structural form of race-based domination that emerged after slavery. Given its entrenchment, Washington was convinced that white supremacy would endure for decades, if not a century. Therefore, he believed his people needed to prepare themselves for a prolonged war. Washington offered a conditional moral defense of the politics of deception. For example, in his first autobiography, The Story of My Life and My Work, he recalled that when he was an enslaved child, his mother, on more than one occasion, stole food to feed him and his siblings. Some people blame the enslaved for not being more honest, but I recall many times when, after all was dark and still, in the late hours of the night, when her children had been without sufficient food during the day, my mother would awaken us, and we would find that during the day she had gotten from somewhere food. Perhaps by some code of ethics, this would be classed as stealing, but deep down in my heart, I can never decide that my mother, under such circumstances, was guilty of theft. Had she acted thus as a free woman, she would have been a thief, but not so, in my opinion, as a slave. Washington argued that enslaved people, given their subjection to the oppressive institution, did not owe the agents upholding that system transparency, truthfulness, or even honesty. In many cases, he further explained, enslaved people had to depart from ordinary ethics to survive and resist bondage. A further and often unseen injustice of the institution emerged in this passage. namely that slavery made it strategically disadvantageous and at times practically impossible for enslaved people to live up to the moral code of society. It threw them outside the bounds of law. Washington's crucial point was that we should recognize that the code of ethics according to which the oppressed must live, in most cases, does not seamlessly map onto the moral standards of a far less oppressive context. And that fact proved a source of ethical remorse for him, regret that he lived and led under conditions that compelled him to cultivate and teach dark virtues. Booker T. Washington believed conditions of acute oppression converted certain moral virtues into political vices. That's the main claim. He thought many virtues considered fundamental for becoming a good person and a respectable citizen applied to African Americans. But he also thought that African American Southerners needed a set of auxiliary virtues that enabled a dual subjectivity that would allow its possessor to survive and safely resist white supremacy. The mores regulating conduct applied differently to white and black Americans. An African-American teenager could not tell a white person what she really thought of him without risking death. Making it to adulthood doomed her to cultivating different and contradictory inclinations. In public, she had to appear amenable, even submissive. Her manner, speech, and conduct had to evince compliance with a system she loathed. But offstage, among fellow African Americans, she could be sincere, honest, and independent. Momentarily discarding her mask, she could allow rage to creep into her voice and hatred of oppression to flicker in her eyes. In the Jim Crow South, a fatal uncertainty hung over all interracial interactions. Basically, this resulted in what we can call a moral coordination problem. Black Southerners had to discern which whites they could look in the eye, speak candidly with, and relate to as social equals, and which whites expected them to show compliance and perform deference, or else. The result was a poisonous diffidence, anxiety, fear, and anguish exacerbated by an unbroken shadow of terror. The renowned writer and former Tuskegee student Ralph Ellison describes the need for preemptive deception in the South. Among his autobiographical notes, he explained that not all Southern whites were hostile, but it was wise to act as though they were until convinced otherwise. And even then, you try to anticipate how much they deviated from tradition, he said. Ellison further advised that the presence of Southern whites who were not racially hostile hardly mattered because they were a minority. Washington understood all too well that certain conditions called for strategic deceit rather than open defiance. Wearing a compliant mask allowed him and others to check the power of whites without inviting suspicion and confrontation. These reflective dispositions were what I've labeled dark virtues, or at times subaltern virtues. The term dark has within its orbit equivocation, cunning, and deception. A dark virtue is a political force remaining in the dark or unseen. Insincerity only works if others believe you're sincere. Second, the concept of dark virtues denotes qualities white and black citizens considered morally troubling, even wrong, which only deepen the need to hide their use. Thus, here, dark makes use of the common association between lack of light and lack of good intentions. Finally, the pro tanto wrong of deceiving fellow citizens compelled Washington to bury his heretical teachings between the lines and beneath the surface of his written work, thus consigning them to the dark. Most readers then, and perhaps even now, are unreceptive to any justification for deception, including a conditional one. We're all strangely Kantian in this way. Besides, Washington's radical political projects depended on his ability to deceive white readers. into believing he was a conservative or reasonable black leader they could work with, someone willing to work within the system. Directly defending deception would have undercut white Southerners' forbearance and white Northerners' benevolence. Some might say Washington should not have lied to the lynchers at his door that night Thomas and Wiley Harris sought protection. But at that moment, a truthful response would have been wrong. In the Jim Crow South, Kant would have gotten you killed. Washington's actions were deeply moral in an altogether and quite Kantian way, however. If we agree that only activities done from duty have moral worth, what should we make of his decision to protect the man and lie about doing so, to derive no esteem or no applause from actually doing his duty? Washington did the right thing, knowing his decision would bring him no increased esteem. In fact, he did so knowing he would draw contempt for publicly saying he turned the men away, when in fact he had saved them. And he was indeed widely assailed. The public lie earned him applause from white Southerners, but to some of the members of his race who mattered most, he appeared a coward and a traitor, an Uncle Tom. Washington's lie was a form of resistance and moral self-assertion in the face of grave threat. Still, his more radical critics might argue that he should have resisted white supremacy openly by providing shelter and confronting the mob. Today, we might demand of him what so few of us are going to be willing to do in the coming years: confront tyranny and risk everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Desmond, for a hugely interesting and revisionary picture of Washington. The fellows and residents, we began with the murder at the door many months ago, but as you gradually unveiled this other story, I was struck by the kind of dirty hand story you're telling, which is powerful. I'm going to save my question. I never would jump the queue in this setting. I want to turn to the group. So who wants to start? Go ahead, Lucas. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. That was quite fascinating and captivating. My question is, if you write in your interpretation of his actions, why do you think he did never try at the end of his life, or maybe he did, and you did mention, to set the record straight, especially as someone who could write, and the risk decreases when you're nearing the end of your life. Hence, there could have been a confession, maybe. Why did this not occur? What did it?
It did occur. I don't want to flip back all the way, but if you look at the table of contents, chapter 3 on under words, it's on concealment, which is about his speeches. Chapter 4 is on, chapter 3 is on equivocation, which is his public speeches. Chapter 4 is on concealment, the use of autobiography. But chapter 5 is on his politics of deception, and he does make an explicit defense of deception, but he does so deceptively. He writes a biography of Frederick Douglass, and he reinterprets Douglass as a great theorist of deception. And he puts all of his own views in Douglass's mouth. I show that in chapter 5. And what he does is he makes a kind of thoroughgoing argument that if you look at Douglass, especially his post-war legacy, Douglass was very adept at practicing this. And in this way, in some ways here should say I draw some on Leo Strauss's writings on writing under persecution. But what I want to do is I want to go beyond that, because I also don't want to take on any of the kind of anti-modernist or conservative baggage. But he is insightful on that. But it only gets us so far. So the archives is what brings it out. So on the one hand, we don't necessarily need just for him to reveal to the reader. We could see that in the argument he's using, Douglass. But by going and recovering letters with his editors, for example, sometimes his own editors will say, you don't really want to say that. And he'll pull something. Another thing I showed throughout the book, he'll write a letter that's just really angry, and one of his colleagues, like T. Thomas Fortune, will say, you can't say that, I'll publish it in my name. So he would use proxies to actually publish his stronger claims. when he was pursuing the court cases, there's a famous story, like he wins a major case with the federal court almost just before he gets to the Supreme Court. And there are these headlines that are ran throughout in the North saying, celebrating the lawyer who won the case, Smith. And it says, if we only had a black leader like him. But one didn't know that Washington was actually funding the cases and coordinating them, right? So this is the kind of story, like, you have to go beyond, like, between the lines, or you have to go beyond looking for his clear defenses.
Thank you.
Just wanted to pick up on this point since we were on a Washington Douglas sort of thing. And the quote that you had from him about his mother stealing struck me because, as I'm sure you know, Frederick Douglass says something very similar where he says, if the slave stole, he took but his own. And he says if he murdered his master, he was just modeling the heroes of the Revolution.
I'm just taking it out of one bucket and putting it in the other myself. That's the exact language he uses, right, for justifying stealing food from hunger.
Got you.
Yeah.
Got you. I'm curious, because it seems to me that a large piece of the argument about deception as a dark virtue would hang on a sense of the political sort of ideals or political imperative in which that's in service of. So I'm wondering how you might see a difference between what Douglas is saying, where it seems he's having a broader critique of property as such, versus what something like this passage that you drew out for us meant for Booker T. Washington.
So that's good. So one thing is, like, so when Douglas writes this, it's first in the narrative, what he writes it in 45, but then it really brings it out in 55, in My Bondage, My Freedom. He's writing as part of an abolitionist public sphere. He's writing for an abolitionist audience. He's trying to mobilize opposition to slavery. He's writing 3 decades after slavery's ended. There's no point in mobilizing opposition to slavery. The ends are very different. And one of the other things that occur, and a lot of scholars don't pay enough attention to this. One of the things I'm trying to argue in the book is that it was harder for a black leader to get a hearing in 1900 than in 1850. And the reason why is the abolitionist public sphere is gone. And all the editors, so there's one thing the book really tries to bring out is the role of white editors in determining what would be published. So, Souls of Black Folk, the text of the African American tradition, right? The most brilliant book written in the tradition, in my estimation, goes with a very tiny press in Chicago. Doubleday Page would never look at that or give Du Bois that opportunity, right? So in order to get certain kinds of arguments even to readers beyond black readers, if you're interested in reaching the white public, you could only be published through these newspapers like The Atlantic, like Harper's, but they're all controlled by a handful of white editors that will literally rule out any kind of radical claim. So one of the things we make this assumption all the time, when we put Du Bois in Washington, if you just go do an engram when you get home and you look at their names, no one's reading up from the Souls of Black Folk until the 1950s, on the lead up to the Civil Rights Movement. It just doesn't have that reception. Up From Slavery is widely read, and the only book that then surpasses it is, of course, Richard Wright's Native Son. So part of the thing is the way the editorial context is shaping what could be said and how things could be said. Again, as a historian of political thought, we spend a lot of time writing about context, but there's 2 kinds of context people never consider with Washington. He's a college president. Everything he says as a college president. I don't think I need to tell anyone here that saying the wrong thing as a college president can be costly. Or even saying the right thing, actually, can be costly. And he was doing it in Jim Crow conditions. And the second is everything you publish went through white editors and white publishers. In other words, white supremacy exercised a veto on voice if you wanted to reach a big audience.
Yes.
about the politics and kind of ethics of deception, in that Washington was viewed by the white public as a kind of conservative accommodationist, but was undermining white supremacy in public. I'm wondering, in your research, if you found any sense that Washington considered what he was doing as moral deception, or did he rather see it as inevitably pragmatic, or are those the same thing?
It's a good question because I suggested moral remorse, or it's a dirty hands problem. And there are these Walserian moments in his writing. So there's one moment where a student writes a donor, Francis Garrison, and thanks him, Francis Villard actually, who is the grandson of the William Lloyd Garrison, or I think his son. Anyways, writes him and thanks him for her scholarship. And she says, you know, I've read Kant, I've been studying Mozart, I've read all these figures, etc. And he blows a gasket. He writes Washington and saying, I'm funding these scholarships for you to teach carpentry and mechanics. Why are you teaching these courses? Washington then writes back, and I'm getting to the point here with this story. Washington then writes back and says, no, the student's exaggerating. She doesn't learn any of that. She's in the choir. What does she know about Mozart? So this is a kind of challenge for the historian. Is he telling the truth, or is she? So I go through, so what do? You go through the archives. You go through the course catalog. You go through the library. You go through the syllabi to the degree they have them. And what do you find? Actually, she's telling the truth. The curriculum is exactly the same as that as Carleton or any liberal arts college in the North. In fact, they're using many of the same books Princeton and Harvard were using for the basic course. I'll show you. So what was one note here? Notice the New Yorker cartoon, right? It's the image of the Klan. My good friend Johann Frick made me this for my birthday, and he commissioned an artist to do it. And he could not find an artist in Berkeley willing to change someone's art. And it was this whole ethical back and forth. And we finally found someone, but we will not name him or her, or they, because I wasn't going to hang that in my office. In fact, actually, it's at home. I actually only have Douglas and Kant in my office because I'm actually not a consequentialist. I just like thinking that they might be right about something. I'm not convinced yet. But what was Washington hiding? This is how he would present the school in magazines. So everyone has this image of Tuskegee. This is the view we have of the university. This is what people think of Tuskegee, right? But that's what it looked like. That's not the image we have of Tuskegee, the dining club, the libraries, the faculty. So he would describe the mechanical program, the industrial program this way. Let me show you back here quickly. That's his description, basically. The mechanical program is basically students building houses. And you think of it as just physical labor. But then when you actually go through, what he meant by that is they actually had an architecture department. The agricultural school was actually chemistry department and biology departments and soil chemistry, etc. So to answer your question, right? So finally, to answer your question, he then writes in response to the college treasurer, Warren Logan, and he says, all future scholarships need to be put in the general fund so we never have a letter go out like this again. And secondly, change all the catalogs. Take all the books they're reading per class off the catalogs. Just publish the title of the courses. And third, we're just going to have to smile and bear it. the donors will not continue to fund us if they know this. And that shows the sense of agent regret.
Arthur?
Thank you so much. The premise of my question may actually be wrong, in which case this is the part. But I'm thinking about, what do I know about Booker T. Washington? Well, very little. But I have read Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and was assuming that that's a fictional portrayal of Booker T.
Yeah,
Washington.
Dr. Bledsoe.
Okay, so it's a question about reception. So what is Ellison up to? Is Ellison simply, like me, profoundly ignorant about Booker T. Washington, or is he doing something more interesting?
It depends what you think the lesson of. So in the chapter you're thinking about is obviously when I.M. is tasked with driving the donor Norton around, and he goes and mistakenly shows him True Blood in the cabin and how they're living in the incest scene. And also he takes him to this bar and gets in a lot of trouble, and he comes back. And Bledsoe, the college president, the founder, he's not the founder though, so it's a question whether he's actually Washington, he's Morton, or so let's just bracket and say maybe he is the founder here. And there's this famous scene, Bledsoe's about to go meet Norton, and I.M. is standing there, and he goes to a mirror and he adjusts his face before he walks in and does a completely different performance. So here's one thing you might read. If you think I.M. is the hero of that story, you have a very critical view of Washington. If you think that's an Hobbesian story or a story about realism, you have a different reading. And my reading of that novel is I.M. keeps making the same mistake over and over and over again. He keeps handing this letter that Bledsoe wrote to him that says, don't hire this student. He never checks the letter. He just takes it on good faith. Every situation he's in, he doesn't practice prudence. He constantly falls into these traps, right? And I want to argue that Ellison is more Washingtonian than we think. That actually Bledsoe is not quite the way readers take him to be. It's a kind of shallow reading of him. If you really follow I.M.'s constant mistakes, it's not till the end. And how does the novel end? He turns inward and he goes below ground with 1,000 lights from the White Power Company, the Light and Power Company, right? And he talks about slowly sifting away their power, right? He comes exactly to the same conclusion of someone like Breakaway, who worked in the paint factory. So that's a roundabout way of answering the question.
Desmond, since you invoked Johann Frick,
Yes.
I have to ask a question in the spirit of Frickian work, which is the respective work that's done by occupying the role of a college president, that kind of agent-relative position he sits in, but also the general fact he is just one among a large group of oppressed people. And so when you talk about the moral claims being voided, those get voided independent of serving as a college president. So in some ways, what I want to know is when he's confronted at the door, even if he had lost his job as president, which also happens the day before, he still would have had every reason to be dishonest. In the case, what's remarkable about this case is it's self-abnegated dishonesty, right? It's sacrificial dishonesty, which I think is very important to you as well. So how do these conspire together? You know, I mean, Johann's work is all about how we think about the
I don't need the institutional claim to defend that. The institutional claim is doing something slightly different here. What I want to point out is if you take an institutional path against white supremacy, you build black institutions. You create a school, you create a business organization, etc. There are these concrete things that can be bombed and can be destroyed. So if he's Ida B. Wells, he could move to Chicago and maybe get a new printing press. But you can't move, 50 buildings and thousands of students to a different city. So there's a way in which when you take an institutional path, it has a constraining and a silencing on your voice. So the institution actually has a constraining effect on voice as well. So because it expands the range of threats, but also it introduces these kind of lateral obligations to others. So even though he would be justified in that way, I do think taking seriously that he's writing as as the leader of a black institution. And that is different than being a tenured professor like Du Bois. Right? I mean, we are paying attention to this in this moment, right? College presidents don't have the same latitude as faculty members. And I think that's one of the things that just, I guess Trump came through for me on this point. It just turned out to be fortuitous in that way that we haven't really wrestled with that fact. Because we haven't considered, like one of the things I'm showing throughout the book is not just, the states just didn't fund black universities because it's the South. So they were completely beholden to white donors. But these donors would not donate anything unless you actually promoted a particular path, right? So the institutional role there is not so much to really morally justify the actions, but to also explain some of the range of why he didn't confront publicly. So why he sticks it in Douglas's mouth. Does that help?
It does, and that's the kind of speaker relativity that you're invoking that's distinct about that role, right? And that was the freaking note. Yes, Josh.
Okay, great. So wonderful talk, and I really liked the phrase, and was struck by the phrase of moral coordination problem that you mentioned. It occurs to me that there may be another kind of moral coordination problem here that I'm wondering about, which is how much does Washington's strategy, or Washington's practice, and the virtuousness of this practice, that it can actually constitute a form of virtue, depend on a kind of division of labor where he's able to function in this way because other people are functioning in a different way.
Yeah.
And so I was struck by the example you gave of this correspondent who said, you can't say this, I'll put it out under my name. Does this sort of Washingtonian ethics and strategy require a much more confrontational, radical partner in order to really be justified, in order to really work the way that Washington is intending it to, so that it may be justified, but only as part of this larger and much more complicated practice?
That's right. I mean, it's conditional, but it's also conditional to the South. So one of the things that's a real puzzle is that as early as 1902, the year before The Souls of Black Folk gets published, Du Bois started working with Washington on the secret campaigns. He started writing. He started helping coordinate him. So Du Bois knew Washington was pursuing these court cases, though in Souls, he suggests that he was normatively committed to disenfranchisement. And that's just sort of a puzzle why he outright lies. And one way to read that is that and this is how David Levering Lewis reads it, as their struggle was so personal and venomous. But another way to read it is that Du Bois understood that a different strategy was required in the North, and Washington did not have a problem with that, actually. He was perfectly fine with that. He recognized that, and he thought black leaders should be openly protesting. They could do that in New York or Chicago. I.W. Wells could write strongly from Chicago. But black Southerners couldn't do that. And what he was rejecting is the idea that that strategic response was being demanded of them from the North. So he saw a division of labor there. I think Du Bois's worry runs deeper, and it's a democratic worry. Du Bois, towards the final chapters in Souls, what you really, and this is what I argue in the book, what Du Bois really worries about is he recognizes, there's this subtle critique, where Du Bois recognizes that Washington is teaching deception and realism. But then at the end, towards the end of the book, Du Bois' fear is that that would become permanent habits. And in those later chapters, his argument, there's some really kind of deeply problematic, bordering on anti-Semitic moments in the final chapters of the book, where he talks about this is what's occurred with the Jewish population, reliance on this since the medieval period for surviving anti-Semitism. It becomes tainted, it becomes part of your character, a kind of deception. So I think that's Du Bois's worry right there.
Julie. Yeah.
First of all, I want to say amazing talk, probably one of the most interesting I've had the privilege to listen to, so thank you for that. So I want to say something, like I agree with this, but I feel like I need a better reason why.
Okay.
And I think you mentioned earlier that that he would have been right, even because I mean this is almost like the beautiful version of the trolley problem, where you get to take the person off the tracks and do the sensible thing that all of us came up with as kids, instead of just let the train run over one or the other, right? Where you get to save the person and also keep it secret, and so everything works out in the end. It's like a Disney
There's a
movie.
third lever.
Yeah, right. This is like a Disney movie, except
Someone should tell Francis that. Yeah.
so, but peradventure it wasn't like that. And you said that, like, even in that case, to protect the students of the university, to protect the institution more broadly, he would have been in the right, and to turn them away. And I feel like it seems, I mean, I agree with that, but it feels a little sociopathic too, to some extent. And I guess it's also now kind of a relevant question, but
No.
how would you say that interplays with like all the things that, like, what would you give as like more of an explanation for that? And then also, how would you say that interplays with the fact that in some cases now, these are being done by people who are not oppressed institutions, who are not representing people who are maybe as particularly vulnerable?
That might change soon. But you're right. So the concluding chapter is called Tragic Realism for a reason. And the whole point I'm trying to argue in this book is that the oppressed will never survive their oppression morally unscathed. That's the thing about how oppression works. There's no easy path out. So in this case, you might think there's a kind of easy path out. He's able to lie, save them, and save the school. But he died knowing he's seen as a race traitor. Though he spent his whole life, actually spent his whole life savings fighting court cases. So on the one hand, he bore that personal harm, right? So there are three kinds of harms, and what makes it a tragic realism. The first is just moral remorse, guilt, and these other kinds of questions, a kind of dirty hands problem. The second is that there's an expressive injury. This is a concern for Du Bois. So even if, when he actually placed the white supremacists, it benefits the race as a whole in the South at a very minimal level, maybe it reduces violence or something like that, he nonetheless affirms the ideology of white supremacy. And that is what I might call an expressive injury or a social injury. He shores that up. And then the third, and here I draw a lot on work by people like Timur Kuran and others, what we know from people who study autocratic regimes is that under these conditions, citizens start falsifying their preferences. And once you start falsifying your preferences, once everyone starts wearing a mask, people start to believe the repression is more durable than it has to be. So, for example, when you think of Hungary, these other places, as they started collapsing, everyone was like, what do you mean? I thought this was just permanent, right? The citizens were kind of shocked at how fragile some of the autocracies actually were. So there's a way, an indirect way, in which what is strategically necessary may unwittingly shore up in citizens' minds the kind of intractability of white supremacy. So these are all the things that make it sort of tragic, right? And that's the idea. Like, it's not a happy ending, so to speak.
Yes.
There you go, I think. Thank you. No, it's a great talk. I mean, I think kind of in a similar vein as the question before last. I mean, it seems like part of the justification was that Washington gave was that, you know, by practicing white supremacy, whites forfeited their right to truthfulness in some way. And I think there's maybe an additional worry there, though. Did he see in any way, sort of by, you know, doing this probably justified untruthfulness, this probably justified dishonesty, did that pose any potential worry that that logic might be flipped around in the long run? Was he attuned to any possibility of sort of long-term pragmatic negative consequences of this approach, or?
Yeah, I mean, he kind of is implicit in that passage I read. So one worry is that it played to the stereotype to some degree that's already present. But another, and Du Bois points this out in a very powerful remark. Du Bois says, Washington was beloved by white people, but he hated them. He never trusted them. He never revealed himself to them. And Du Bois says this is one of the epigraphs I have. And there's a bizarre way in which, I wouldn't say he hated, like, he was a slave for his first 9 years. Like, he just had no faith in white America. And the reason he had no faith in white America is him and Du Bois fundamentally disagree on the nature of white supremacy. Du Bois thought it was a form of moral ignorance. It could be argued down. Washington thought white supremacy was reason insensitive and evidence insensitive. It was like a faith. It was almost intractable to permanent. So this is what Garvey sees in Washington. And this is what black nationalists for generations have seen in Washington, from Garvey to Harold Cruz. So there's just a way in which, you know, and this is the key, the judgments you make about the nature of the problem, if you think it's a question of moral ignorance, then reform and protests have incredible value because you have a causal mechanism of how to undo it. Protest corrects ignorance, which then actually reduces commitment to white supremacy. But if you think it's reason insensitive and argument insensitive, you're not going to advocate protest because you know it has no conversion power. And the way you know this is what happens in 1867, 2 years after slavery ends. 6 northern states hold referenda on whether blacks should get political equality or to vote. And do you know what the outcome was in all 6 states? No. So he saw and he understood that being anti-slavery did not commit abolitionists to racial equality. So they just have very different views of the read of the promise of America. In my view, he's perhaps the first Afro-pessimist. Some could argue Delaney was. Kedrick might disagree.
Is this great? It's on. Thank you. Thank you so much for this talk. I was thinking about how oppression doesn't just generate oppressed subjects, but it also generates, reproduces, and depends upon differences in structural position among the oppressed subjects. So one difference in structural position that you brought up during the talk was office holders versus non-office holders. But I was thinking about other kinds of differences in structural position, like gender, elites versus mass, any number of these things, workers versus bourgeois, and so on. And I wonder if your account gives us a way to think about whether oppression then generates moral demands or moral constraints or other kinds of problems that are differentiated across these different structural positions. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question. It's a good question. So one way to think about it, I mean, it's the way I actually designed my course in History of Black Political Thought. I have like a module on slavery, right? I read 3 different thinkers, and each of them recognize the essential wrong-making of slavery differently. And that leads to different strategic responses and normative responses. For Harriet Jacobs, it's ownership. And by focusing ownership, she's able to tell a story about how different property rights lead to different specifically gendered wrongs. So use rights transforms sexual assault into a property right. And that doesn't come across in a domination conception of citizenship. Right? Property is what brings that into focus. So one there is just, you think around gender, like the story someone like Wells tells or Jacobs, it brings in a kind of different side of the nature of the oppression. So one thing you want to do, I think, when you're studying the history of any oppressed group, is you really want to attend to the moral diversity of that group, right? So there is this habit that's very contemporary that treats, it's less so now, in the wake of incredibly important work by people like Michael Dawson and others, but it still persists in treating the Black intellectual tradition as something like the Black radical tradition or something, or it treats an oppressed group, a tradition of thought, as fairly homogenous. And I actually think a tradition, an intellectual tradition, really comes alive when you see the internal diversity within it and the deep, deep disagreements. So I would go even further and says, like, it's not just a question of subject identities, gender, or class. People are also just on principle deeply opposed. Some people might be gradualist. Some thinkers are. Some are more confrontational and defiant, et cetera. And I think what you want to do is you want to attend to that, but you don't want to pretend you can capture that in the study of any one thinker or the study of any one moment, right? And you want to really kind of put these boundaries. Like, one of the things, I'm generally deeply suspicious whenever someone writes a book that's going to give me all the complexities of a world that would take like 20 lifetimes to really catch and to really capture. So I guess it's a roundabout way of answering your questions. Some of these questions I'm able to answer in the book, but some of them I'm not. Like, he shouldn't, like, if you really want to know much more about gender in this period, like, I.W. Wells is where you go. He's terrible on that. And if you actually really want to do a more conservative view, there are actually other thinkers in this period that might be more kind of interesting, like Alexander Crummell or others.
Well, I want first, before we thank Desmond, I want to thank our colleagues that made this event possible, including Claire, Sue, Meg, Alex. We really appreciate this great event. It requires no self-fabrication to say that this was a wonderful, is that the term? What was the term?
Abnegation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
No preference falsification.
Falsification, right, to say this was a wonderful lecture, and it brought us through Dirty Hands from Walzer to Thompson's Democratic Dirty Hands. You have all those versions of it. So I'm grateful and look forward to the conversation later, too. Thank you, Desmond.